Hey guys, welcome to another video here on the Aviation Pro channel. In this video I'd like to show you my Prepared version 4 settings. Now, as you may see in my videos, Prepared runs very smoothly on my system. I rarely go below 20 frames per second. The overall experience is very smooth, and the terrain looks pretty good as well. So I'm just going to take you through my settings, so you just can take it over and use it. You can find my specs of my PC in the description. And I'll first go through the general prepared settings, which you can access right here if you start it up. And then I'll also take a look at my video card settings, also some configuration file tweaks of prepared, and finally a short look at Active Sky, see what kind of settings are important there. So first, prepared settings that we'll go through. Now, of course, the first few menus items are very based on personal preference. You can just kind of pause the video if you want and take over these settings as necessary. So I'll just scroll through them. Most of this stuff I've turned off just for realism. I don't really like to see those red labels over top other aircraft when flying on VATSIM. So there you go. Then the sound, most of it is left as default. Only thing I turned off is voice, because I don't like hearing default ATIS by accident when flying on VATSIM. So just to be sure, I've turned that off as well. Now, the first important settings that will affect our frame rate is probably traffic. And as you can see, I've put it all to 0. Now, airline and general aviation traffic, I've turned to 0 because I only fly on VATSIM basically. So I really don't need to see AI traffic. Then for the airport vehicle density, this basically adds, airport vehicles at default airports. Now, most of my flights are to airports where, there's already custom scenery, so also custom vehicles that are driving around, and that's not affected by this slider. So just to reduce frame rates or to improve frame rates and reduce settings a little bit, I've just turned it off. It's not really necessary. Now, road vehicles can severely impact your frame rates, especially if you fly into urban areas and large urban areas. So again, just for the sake of frames, I've turned it all the way to 0. Some custom sceneries already have road vehicles driving around the highways of the airport, for example, Flight Tampa Amsterdam, and again, that's not affected by this slider, so I've just turned it off. And same for ships and leisure boats. They probably don't have a huge impact. You might turn on a little bit just to have some variety, especially if you fly near areas with a lot of water. But again, for the sake of improving frame rate, I've turned it all the way to 0, because usually I don't, probably would not notice it when I'm making an actual flight. So that's that. Realism settings, most of it's personal preference, so you can just pause the video if necessary and take over these settings. Basically, I've set the highest realistic and realism settings available. Then we'll go to the graphics section, and that's of course the most important one. So first of all, when you are the display settings, we have image and texture quality. I've turned FXAA off because as you can see, it smooths edges of objects, but somehow it kind of makes it look a little bit blurry, and especially the virtual cockpit starts to look a little bit blurry, and I don't really like that. So to save frame rates and to make everything look a bit more crisp, I've turned it off. The anti-aliasing I've set to 4 times multi-sampling. Now this really impacts your frame rates, especially when you have dynamic lighting turned on, and we're going to take a look at that later. I've turned it on, and I've personally set it to just 4 times multi-sampling. The reason why is that, yes, I do see the jaggies in the distance, especially on a clear day, but during most of my flights, I don't really notice it, and especially when the visibility is reduced, it doesn't really impact the visual quality of the scenery anyway. So yes, you will get some jaggies with lower settings like multi-sampling, but if you set super sampling, and you have dynamic lighting turned on, it severely impacts frame rates. So I would just use multi-sampling at least, and then I chose the kind of the middle value, 4 times multi-sampling. If you have a high resolution monitor like Ultra HD, like 4K, then anti-aliasing doesn't really matter that much more anyway, so you could just lower it as well. So there you go. Texture filtering, well, this doesn't really have an impact on performance anymore, so you just can put it to the highest settings for the best looks, 16 times. Texture resolution, I've put it to high. You can definitely notice this in the clouds, especially when using something like Rex Skyforce. But again, just to save some frame rates here and there, I've just lowered it a notch. It still looks great, and it saves some frame rates. Now you want to make sure, if you're using things like ASCA or Rex Skyforce or Rex 4 Texture Direct, you want to make sure that their textures are also set to the same value, so 2048 times 2048. It doesn't make sense to select ultra textures in Rex Skyforce and then putting the prepared settings to high settings. Okay, so you want to make sure they match up, otherwise the sim is going to try to reduce the ultra settings that of the Rex textures that are installed. It's trying to reduce that to higher settings. So you just want to make sure that the texture resolution you've set here matches the texture resolution of the stuff that you set in things like Rex Skyforce or ASCA. Well, then of course here you have the GPU, as you can see, and my resolution. You just want to make sure you put that to your native resolution. And then we have the frame rate controls, which are the most important. Now, this can really impact your frame rates a lot, so you have to pay attention a little bit here and kind of experiment with these settings. Now, it really depends kind of what monitor you have and what GPU. If you have something like AMD's FreeSync or NVIDIA's G-Sync, then you want to turn off VSync and triple buffering in Prepared and put the frames to unlimited. Now, what these features of these GPU developers do is that it matches the refresh rate of the monitor to the frame rate in the sim. And having VSync off, lets the sim benefit from this, because what I notice, if I've turned VSync on and I also have FreeSync on, the frames are a little bit lower. So I would recommend, if you use either FreeSync or G-Sync, and if you have a monitor that supports that, leave VSync off in the sim. If you don't have any of these features, so if you have a standard monitor, it's best to turn on VSync and triple buffering and put the frames to unlimited. And what this will do is it will match your frame rate to the refresh rate of your monitor. So for example, when your refresh rate is 60 Hz, it will try to maintain 60 frames per second. When your frames go below that, it will go to 30 frames per second. And you might think, oh wow, my frames are then suddenly a lot lower. Yes, but it will make the picture much more smooth. And you don't have that much stutters. Okay, so I would definitely experiment with the settings. So if you have FreeSync or G-Sync, turn it off and frames to unlimited. If you have no FreeSync or G-Sync features, then turn this on and triple buffering on and frames to unlimited. Okay, that works best. Then a view and panel settings, wide view aspect ratio, you want to have to turn on if you have a widescreen monitor or even ultra wide, and also turn on mid-map PC panels. And 2D panel transparency I've personally set to 0. Then we go to world, and of course these are also important settings that can impact your frame rates. Level of detail radius put to ultra, just to reduce a little bit of frames here and there. Same for the tessellation factor and the mesh resolution. These kind of determine how sharp and crisp the mountains look around you. Some sceneries might require you to increase the mesh resolution, so make sure you check that out. Personally, with 5 meters, I've never had any problems, and in general, the scenery, especially mountainous areas, looks very good. So this kind of reduces the load on the GPU as well, especially when there are a lot of clouds in the area. Texture resolution for the ground detail, again, I just moved it down a notch. It still looks great, and it just improves frame rates a little bit. I've unticked high resolution terrain textures. I'm gonna show you a setting in the prepared configuration file in a minute. Then scenery objects. Now I've always turned it to extremely dense, because especially add-on airports, if you want to have all buildings modeled, I have to put the setting very high, okay, to extremely dense. So if you lower this, you might miss out on some buildings of your add-on airports. So just put it to extremely dense. The oxygen draw distance can also severely impact frame rates, especially on extremely high. I know there's quite a performance hit, so I've tuned it down a notch. Now the thing with Prepared is that oxygen kind of loads in batches and quite late on arrival sometimes, especially when there's a lot of oxygen in the area. That's something that Prepared has to fix. If you kind of want to reduce that effect, you can put this setting to high. But if you want to see more oxygen in the distance, especially when you depart out of an airport, you can put it to very high. And then for the densities of the building and vegetation, I've just put it to dense. If you put it any higher, it can impact frame rates quite a lot. But this looks fine and provides the best results for me personally. Dynamic 3D oxygen vegetation, there's also a new feature that came with Prepared version 4. You want to turn it off. Basically what this will do is it will show how the trees react to the wind of, for example, a helicopter that's landing nearby. And although it might look cool, it really has a big impact on frame rate, so it's better to turn it off. Water detail, personally I've put it to low. It doesn't probably impact frame rates that much, but I don't really care about the looks of the water. Even the low setting looks pretty good to me, especially from high altitude, so it's fine. Same for the reflections. I don't really care about the reflections personally. It's just a personal setting, but again, just to save a few frame rates here and there, I've turned most of these settings off. Then the special effects, I've put it all the way to high, and I've not really noticed a big difference with these settings. So yeah, you can just put it to high. This is kind of the settings for the fireworks and the smoke of industrial areas, for example. Then we go to lighting. Personally, I've disabled HDR lighting because I don't really like the looks of it. From my personal experience, I don't think it has a very big impact on frame rate. So, you can just play around with the settings and adjust it to your liking. But I like the looks of Prepared better without it, so I've just turned it off. Dynamic reflections can have an impact on frame rate, so I just would turn it off. You don't really need it. Now, dynamic lighting, this is something you really want to turn on. This is a new feature of Prepared version 4. And what this will do is kind of, things like landing lights and taxi lights will now also eliminate objects that are in front of it. Some aircraft might not show their landing lights if this option is turned off. So if you want to have landing lights and taxi lights visible, you have to turn it on using this setting on most new add-on aircraft for Prepared version 4. Again, if you're using this, make sure you select a low anti-aliasing setting, otherwise you're really gonna feel a big frame rate impact. But I would not recommend turning this off because it's a great feature that will really improve the lighting of the airport at night. So yeah, the landing lights illuminate ground. Of course, you want to have to turn it on. Personally, I've disabled lens flare because if you ever look outside into the sun, which I would not recommend, by the way, but you don't see lens flare yourself either. It's a camera feature that I just don't really like to see in the sim personally. Shadow quality, I've put it to low. Honestly, there's not much of a visual difference with the shadow quality settings, but as a trade-off for the draw distance, I've just put it to low. And any setting like medium or low will generally produce very nice results. If you go any higher, you might get an impact on frame rate. So I've just put it to low, and then the draw distance to ultra. And the reason why I've done this, because sometimes when flying around cloudy areas, you would see a very definite cutoff point when you reduce this setting, and it's kind of unrealistic. So you kind of get a square shadow that because of the boundary of the draw distance. So I've put it all the way to ultra, so that you don't see that boundary in when you're flying, especially when flying in better visibility conditions. Okay, so, and honestly, it doesn't impact frame rates that much, interestingly enough. So you can just put it all the way to ultra. And the casting and receiving for the internal vehicle, you want to have both enabled, and this will also enable cockpit shadows. For the external vehicle, I only have cast shadows, so that you can see the shadow of the aircraft on the ground when you look outside. All the others I've turned off. you really don't need it that much, and it can severely impact frame rate, especially terrain shadows and building shadows. You know, in practice you don't really look at it and see it, so it really helps to reduce the impact on the frame rate, so I would definitely turn it off. Cloud shadows I have enabled. Now there's a thing we prepared that during dusk and dawn cloud shadows can have a severe impact on frame rate somehow, so you want to kind of play around with this setting, especially when you're flying around these times, because the shadows can really impact the frame rate, especially when you look towards the sun during dusk or dawn. So I'm not sure why that happens, but you know, during daylight it's usually fine. So sometimes I turn these settings off in order to save frame rates during dusk or dawn. Okay, but you know, again, it looks very nice. It really adds a little bit of dynamic to the terrain, so I would leave it on because it looks very realistic. So far for the lighting settings. Now we'll go to weather. Well, these settings you don't really have to touch because most of this is regulated by Active Sky. So I've just put this to maximum, and the cloud draw distance is also managed by Active Sky. You want to select detailed clouds and also volumetric fog, detailed precipitation, and windshield effects. You know, it just looks very good, and I think they did a good job on you know, improving the performance of these features. So turning them on or off personally does not really produce that much of a difference on the frame rates for me personally. And of course also enable turbulence. Yeah, so these are the basic settings I've prepared. I hope that helps, and of course the controls, how you can set it yourself. We'll now take a look at some tweaks that you can do to the apply to the configuration file I've prepared. Now some people say that you should not tinker with the prepared configuration file, and I would recommend the same basically if you're new to Prepared. So if you try Prepared for the first time, just leave these settings alone and just try with the settings that I just showed you and see how it performs. But in the meantime, I found some settings that will just make the terrain look a little bit better, less blurry, and yeah, they also might help with the frame rate. So the first one that I added under the scenery tab of the prepared configuration file, and by the way, in the description you can check how to find the configuration file and you know, what items to add exactly, so you can just copy paste. So under scenery I've set max regions purge per frame to 1. And you know, I'm not a technical expert, and do not know the technical details behind these settings, but kind of what this does, it tells the sim how fast to clear the virtual memory. Now with prepared version 4 going 64-bit, virtual memory is not really an issue anymore. So in order to improve the looks of the scenery, I've set this value to 1. Okay, so make sure you, under the scenery tab, max regions purge per frame to 1. Default is like something like 16 or 4, depending on which sim you're using. So I've set it all the way to 1, which you know, kind of improves the looks of the scenery, reduces blurries, especially in the distance. So I would definitely add this under scenery. The other setting is the affinity mask, and for this you have to add the job scheduler tab. And again, I've also discussed this in my previous tweak guide on prepared version 3. You can watch that guide for more info. Basically what this affinity mask setting does, it will allow you to determine which cores of your processor are being used by the simulator and which are not. So if you go to Task Manager, right here you can see how many logical processors you have. So I have 8. So I can decide which cores to turn on or off. So if you go to a website like this, where you can convert a binary value to a decimal value, you can decide which core to turn on or off. So let's say I want to just use 4 cores, and then 0 codes for turning a core off, and 1 codes for turning a core on. So 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, for example. And this will turn core 0 off, core 1 on, core 2 off, core 3 on, etc. If you convert it to a decimal value, as you can see, that's the value that you want to set as affinity mask. Of course, you can, for example, also turn all of them on except the first one, core 0. In that case, you would use the settings like this. Now, the reason why I'm using 85 like this is, for me, it provides very good results ever since Prepared version 3. Some people say you don't have to set an affinity mask at all, but personally I think setting it helps with the sim, because if you use all cores, some of these cores are also going to be used by Windows, and whenever Windows is running something in the background, it might affect your performance in the sim. So I would experiment with these values. There are some values in the description that are most commonly used by people. I personally use 85, and yeah, you just kind of experiment with this, and with a website like this you can just convert your setting to a decimal value, and that's the value that you set here as affinity mask under job scheduler. So definitely something to experiment with. It can really help improve the smoothness of your sim. Then under the display tab you have the texture bandwidth mode setting. I've increased this value to 160, and what this kind of helps with is that it can reduce the black texture that you see when panning around at an airport, for example. So doing this will make the GPU load some of the textures faster. So I would not go too high on this one. Something like 160 or 120 will be just fine. Then under the terrain tab you want to add texture size EXP is 9. And what this will do is it will make sure that the sim loads higher resolution terrain textures. And again, this helps making the textures look more crisp. And it really kind of depends on how good your GPU is. If you have a good GPU, a setting in like 9 will work perfectly. The default setting is 8, but you want to change it to 9 in order to make the textures more crisp, and also more crisp in the distance. For me this works very well. The only downside is that it will use a lot of memory from the video card. So you can also put it to 10, but it's kind of risky. It can eat up a lot of memory from the video card, video memory. So personally I've set it to 9, and it works very well. I can see a definite difference when using this, and it kind of correlates with the higher resolution terrain texture setting in Prepar that I just showed you, but I've just set it here. So I've turned that setting off, but then I've set texture size EXP to 9, and this in general makes my scenery look very good at a good frame rate as well. And the last setting I've set is use global terrain view is true. Default this is set to false, so it kind of helps also with improving the performance on my system. You can check the link in the description for what this exactly does. Again, it just helps a little bit in my personal opinion, and I've always said this also in Prepared version 3, so it's something that you want to put to true. Now for my video settings, as you can see I'm using an AMD card. I realize most people use things like NVIDIA, so yeah, I'm just showing you these settings so you can pause the video and take over if you use an AMD card as well. Personally, I don't tinker that much with these settings. Basically, it's already fine enough with the default settings. So as you can see, I'm using FreeSync, which is something that you definitely want to enable when you are using this. So you can put it to on like this, and then it will make sure that FreeSync is always used when running the sim. Now lastly, I will go through my Active Sky settings very quickly. Of course, weather also impacts frames a lot, so you definitely want to make sure that this is alright. So the general options, well, I'm not going to go through them, you can just set them yourself. I'm just going to show you these settings to show you what I have set personally. Cloud options. Now cloud layers, you definitely want to reduce this value if you have a lot of frame rates hit, especially in overcast conditions. So I've personally set it to 4. Any higher will definitely have an impact on performance, so make sure you do not set this setting too high. Then cloud turbulence to 100, cloud icing to 100. Prevent thunderstorms when CB is reported. I've turned it on, especially when flying in Europe. Sometimes thunderstorms are really exaggerated if this setting is turned off, so you better have that checkbox enabled. The minimum cloud roll distance is set to 60. and maximum cloud draw distance to 120. And again, if you're running the sim, you can just kind of play around with this. But if you use really high settings on this one, especially in overcast conditions, you know, it can get have a very big impact on frames per second. So make sure you do not set this setting too high. So I've just set it to 120. Then I've turned this setting off. Low cloud offset I've also not tinkered with. Multi-layer thunderstorm clouds I've turned off, especially when using Rec Skyforce. That's not really necessary anymore because those clouds look very big anyway. Cloud motion effect is of course turned on, and then offset I've not tinkered with either. So then we'll go to the wind options. Yeah, I'm just gonna go through these settings. Of course, they do not really impact performance or anything, but just so you can see what I have set. And you know, if you want to, you can pause the video and take that over. Okay, so I've disabled enhanced turbulence because I feel it doesn't really produce very realistic turbulence when flying in bad weather conditions. Maximum downdraft rate to 1000, updraft to 1000. Realistic thunderstorm up and downdraft rates are turned on, and also some random light shock. Most of these options are set to default. Now, visibility options do have some importance regarding frame rates. So, enable wing fade effect I've turned on. Fog layer generation is also set to the default setting. The visibility, now minimum I've set all the way to 0, just the default. Maximum surface visibility I've also set to default 75. You know, any higher is not really necessary unless you have a lot of mountains around you that you want to see in a distance. But yeah, you know, it doesn't really matter that much. Maximum upper visibility I've reduced a little bit. Again, if you put this any higher, you know, in reality you will not be able to look that far anyways. And as you can see, I've also set it to 120, same as the cloud draw distance at altitude. So basically what this will allow me to do is that the clouds are not generated much further away from the visibility layer than necessary. Okay, so again, this is something that you can experiment with on the go as you fly, because you can just apply the changes to the current weather conditions if you change this, and then you will see what it looks like in the sim and how it impacts performance. So you can just kind of play around with this. In-cloud visibility reduction is enabled, and all these settings are at default. So I hope this tweak guide has helped you out, and that these settings might help you improve your frame rates a little bit in Prepared. Again, you have to experiment yourself with these settings. You know, just because this works on my system doesn't mean it works on your system. Especially the affinity mask is something that you have to experiment with yourself. Okay, so make sure you check that out. And yeah, in general, you know, with these settings, my experience with Prepared is just amazing. You know, even flying in Amsterdam, which is a heavy scenery with a complex aircraft like the PMDG 747, I never drop below 20 frames per second, and the frames are just amazing. So, and the experience is smooth, you know, thanks to the FreeSync of AMD. So I hope this video has helped you out. If you like this video, please consider supporting the channel. That would be very much appreciated. You could become my patron on patreon.com/AviationPro. So make sure you check that out, and check out the description for other ways of supporting the channel. It would be very much appreciated. And for now, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.